Good morning, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan, here today with ML Liebler and Jim Daniels, editors of Respect, the Poetry of Detroit Music. And gentlemen, how are you today?
Everything's great here in Detroit. It's sunny in Detroit.
Fantastic. How about you, Jim?
I'm in Pittsburgh, and looks like we're getting a little rain today, but other than that, everything's fine.
Nice. And you're probably getting the rain we had last night. So
it usually comes this way, yeah.
Yeah, right. So, well, guys, thank you for being here today, and thank you, for your wonderful book. And I'm just wondering if you could help our viewers today just get to know you a bit. And I'll start off with Jim. Jim, who are you? What's your background? And what inspired you on this work?
Well, I was born in Detroit and spent my formative years in Warren, right outside Detroit, between 8 and 9 Mile Road there. And I grew up with the soundtrack of my growing up was the music of Detroit. And, ML and I have a lot in common, as you'll see as we talk, but I went to a lot of concerts growing up, and that was kind of my poetry growing up in that area in terms of how it spoke to me and because I didn't know anything about poetry, really. I knew music and concerts and radio. Radio is a big part of that as well. Detroit had great radio. And so it has stayed with me over the years. I've written about it. I was always on alert for other poems about the music of Detroit, just as a fan of the music. And so, and ML and I have been friends for at least 20 years, got to be. Years blur after a while. Yeah, I think more.
What year?
Go ahead.
What year did your award-winning book come out? That Places Everyone?
Well, 85.
Okay, that's when we met.
35 years. Yeah.
Because I remember.
Give or take.
Yeah.
Okay. How about you, ML?
Let's see. Well, I was actually, which is weirdly true, born on Wayne State's campus, and I'm still there after 42 years. So I was born across the street from the Art Institute. That was a hospital. Now it's the mortuary science building for Wayne State. So I don't know if that's a commentary or what. And, I've been teaching at Wayne for a long time, but, I got into music really early. I have a poem, a short poem that really kind of explains that. My grandmother loved Elvis Presley. And so at the tender age of 4, she bought me my first Elvis album. And it's been crazy ever since, essentially. But I got into the music part of it heavily, and continued with that. And over the years, I've written poetry books and edited several anthologies, of which this is one of them. That's the news.
Okay, cool. So I got to ask you guys, right? So not being from Detroit, and knowing that it has this reputation for its music scene, that's really unique, especially in the Midwest. I mean, other cities don't have it. I mean, I got to ask, why do you think Detroit? Why does Detroit have that music scene that it has had for decades, if not more?
Why do you think, Jim?
There's not just one answer, but I think a couple things contribute to it. One is, and I should say that Respect just won the Tilly Olson Prize from the Working Class Studies Association, because I think there's a class element to a lot of the work, and particularly in relationship to Detroit being the Motor City, the car industry, the rhythms of the work, the intensity of the work, and the intensity of the music, I think, connects. And I think sometimes we underestimate the wisdom and intelligence of some of the musicians that come out of Detroit, because people from Iggy Pop to Alice Cooper have spoken spoken very wisely about the influence of Detroit on their music, and on, you know, like Iggy talks about trying to imitate the noise of the machinery in the factory. And certainly when you listen to some of the old Stooges and other Iggy music, you can hear that sort of pounding rhythm. And then you go over to Motown, and there's a lot of repetition in the music and the dance steps and everything that I think also connects to the repetition of the work and the rhythm of the work, and you know, the wanting, the desire to burst out of that. I worked in a Ford plant for some summers to pay my way through college, and you know, you take that, you have that rhythm of the machinery pounding in your head at night when you're sleeping. And so I think you want to burst out of that, and bursting out in loud raucous music is part of that, I think. So those are a couple of things I think contribute to that, because you know, I've been living in Pittsburgh for 40 years. I just retired from teaching at Carnegie Mellon University, and you can compare the two cities in terms of musical influence and worldwide reputation. And you know, Pittsburgh has had a few decent, you know, musicians come through, but not nearly the range and variety and popularity across musical genres that Detroit has had.
Okay. How about you, ML?
Well, you know, it's all of that is a big part of it too, but I don't know, there's something unique, and maybe that's worthy of a deeper discussion or even a conference, I suppose. But on, you know, what is it about Detroit that is different than other places? I mean, I think about this a lot, and because it is unique. It's a different kind of experience. It's totally working class. Maybe a little less than it was when Jim and I grew up. I know that talking to my students, I used to ask the question, you know, when I first started, how many of your parents or your fathers work in a factory? And a lot of students would raise their hand. Now it's rare. One student will raise, you know, his or her hand. But there's something, you know, inherent about the working class culture that does come through in all of the art that comes out of Detroit, whether it be music or poetry. And it does go back to, I think, two things. It is the rhythm of the line in the factory, the continual kind of production, reproduction of items or cars or whatever. I mean, it influenced Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy worked at Ford, and while he was working as a songwriter, you know, in his spare time or whatever, and he, you know, started thinking about the assembly line and applying that to music, and that's exactly what he ended up doing with Motown. Originally, Motown had several houses on West Grand Boulevard right next to each other and across the street.
Right.
And, you know, one house was for recording, one house was for etiquette, one house was for dance steps, one house was for fashion, you know, and it really was just kind of an assembly line, not in a negative way, but it was, you know, an assembly line of production. And then you go back earlier to the jazz and blues part of it, and you've got the Great Migration happening to Detroit. Now, a lot of the blues and jazz and Motown people came out of that experience. So, you know, you combine those two things, and then you throw in working class culture, which is a different kind of thing. And Jim knows, you may know Tim too. I think you're from Wisconsin.
I'm from Milwaukee. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Milwaukee's a
And we only had the Violent Femmes, so yeah. But go ahead.
Yeah.
I like the Violent Femmes.
I do too. Yeah.
So do I. But
I like
that's all
Brian
we had.
Ritchie.
We had that in Liberace, but go ahead.
Oh, it was Liberace.
The most famous
That's great.
Polish Italian in the world. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, so you bring that culture to it, which is a different type of thing. There's different mannerisms, like one of the things is now Jim blew that theory out of the water, but generally working class people, when they grow up and get married and whatever, they usually live like very close to where they were born and raised. And, I certainly, the house I'm sitting in right now is a house, Pam, my wife, we've been together since we were in, what they call it, middle school now, what do they call it, junior high. So I came over to this house, which was walking distance from my house. And even with the other places in the city in St. Clair Shores where we've lived, has always been within walking distance exactly of where we grew up. So that's just one minor little thing, but there's that. And then there's, the things that you're taught growing up. And all of it kind of in Detroit merges to create a very unique culture of both a social culture and also an art culture. And and I think Jim's taken that with him and kept it inside of him. And that happens. And that's also kind of part of the working class. It's like you're always working class. No matter what you do, whether you're a teacher or, or you're actually working on an assembly line, and those are kind of coming back again.
Right.
So, yeah, that's putting all that together is what makes Detroit unique, different. And then of course the music coming out of it's going to be all of that too. And I think this book shows that. It starts with jazz, blues, northern soul, rock, and so forth. And then you look at it in its entirety and you say, wow, all of that came out of Detroit, and it's, yeah, and more, because we don't have everything in there.
So that makes me think, I mean, both of you have talked about you grew up in Detroit and everything else. I mean, when did you start connecting the poetry of the music to, to your own work? And when did you guys start discussing this? You've known each other for 35 years. I mean, when did you start discussing, there's a real, sorry for, lack of imagination on my part, but poetry to what's coming out and what has come out of here. And I guess secondly, like, the discovery of your city. I mean, you guys, I mean, you must have delved, because you cover many different musical genres and writings about the genres from Detroit. I mean, it must have been a real work, and I, just from the looks of it and the feel of the book, almost like a journey of love, like of what came out of your city and what your city's about. And I know that's a really long question. So I'll open it up to whoever wants to try it.
I think ML should start with this one because he's a performer himself, and he comes at it from that end, which is really important for this collection, I think.
Okay.
Well, I think for me, it started long ago, obviously being influenced by music at a young age. And then, 5 years after that, the Beatles come out and change everything for me. And when I look back at everything, the music always played a major role. I started going to concerts when I was pretty young. I think I was 12 when I went to my first concert, which, I have a grandson that's getting close to 12. I can't even imagine him going to a concert, but I was just talking to my wife about that last night, that sort of thing. And my grandparents used to drive. I was raised by my grandparents, and they drive me down to Cobo Hall. Or actually, the first concert I went to was at Ford Auditorium. Okay. And then, we lived right off Jefferson in St. Clair Shores, so we just take the bus back, which is kind of bizarre nowadays to think of. Here's 12-year-olds on a bus at 11:30 at night coming back from Detroit.
Right.
Strange. But so music's always been a part of me. And even early on, what I wanted to do, I was influenced a lot by and I'm no scholar of it, but the poetry of Dylan Thomas, which had a musicality to it, and just the way the words that he used came together. I mean, I remember as a young person, I wanted to write poetry that didn't use words, but it used rhythms and sounds and made up language. Then I found out James Joyce beat me to it. But, you know, I mean, that was kind of where I was starting from. And I was always, you know, close to the music. So when I started to write, which was a pretty young age, I wanted to, it was in my head to bring music and poetry, let's say in my case, merge it together. I thought there could be more appeal to people if it were done that way. And since I was so deeply connected to music all my life, I started thinking of ways to merge the two and, you know, to get a wider audience for poetry, you know, to grow poetry, not to grow my audience, but just to grow poetry. I've often said this, and I think it's true for me anyway, is that if a person like me, from the background I came from, which is very similar to Jim's, I mean, Jim's dad worked on the line for, I don't know, I guess at least 30 years, because it was 30 and out used to be. My grandfather did the same thing. And trying to remember what I was saying, but it was, I got lost in the past for a second. So I wanted to do that. I thought it would be more appealing. And so the two were always equally connected. And that's how I sort of got into the poetry and music part of it. Together is a way to widen the poetry audience. I always look at stuff like that. If you widen the poetry audience, it's better for all of us and the poets out there. It makes more people aware of poetry. And when you bring the music to it in the way that I do that, you know, I've often heard people say, "Wow, this is poetry you can dance to," and it's like, yeah, you know, you can do that and enjoy it, and not get so caught up in the academia of poetry. Kind of put it in the community where it belongs. Jim Gustafson used to always say poetry belongs in the bars and the church basements and you know, in school rooms and places like that, not in the you know, the levels of academia where they talk so much about it that you lose track of what the hell, what are we talking about again? You know, that kind of thing.
How about you?
That makes sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Well, I'll just pick up on that a little bit, just in terms of the overall general stereotypical perceptions, and that's that, like, poetry is highbrow, and, like, for example, rock music is lowbrow. And I think ML and I do not believe in that kind of distinction, because we want to have poetry that's accessible to people. And I think the poetry about music is definitely accessible. And we included a lot of song lyrics in the book as well, because we don't want to make that distinction, say, oh, this is poetry, these are lyrics, because obviously they overlap and blend. And some of these lyrics really stand up well if you just read them on the page.
So that brings a question that comes to mind. So, I mean, how did you guys go about selecting between the lyrics and the poetry? I mean, what was the process? I mean, one of you's in Pittsburgh, one's in Detroit. You know, what were you guys doing? How long? I mean, how long were you working on this to get this together? And
I think it was at least a couple of years, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. I mean, if I go into my email folder for Respect, there's hundreds and hundreds of emails going back and forth between me and ML. At one point, the book was titled "I Just Want to Testify," which we liked as a kind of resonance in terms of the, you know, testifying in music, and, you know, that sort of fervor that it implies. But then when Aretha died, we felt like we had to go with Respect, because that's a big part of it too.
okay.
But yeah, we were working on it at least a couple of years, and being who we are, we both had accumulated various lists in our head of poems and songs that kind of stuck with us, that were about the music of Detroit, because we're, you know, we read a lot too, and we listen to music a lot too. And so we started combining our lists, and we weren't completely methodical about it, but it evolved. And as ML will testify, we ended up with over 400 pages, which is probably double what we were supposed to do.
Yeah, I was thinking of a nice little 150-page book that you could carry around, and it just grew and it grew. But as we remembered or thought of, or in some cases, people we knew, writers, poets, who were sympathetic to Detroit music, some people we asked to write if they would write for the collection. And a few people did exactly that and did a really nice job with it. But so we did that versus putting out an open call. I can't even imagine doing. Jim's probably done that before, but I'm a benevolent dictator, so I go a different route.
So you just basically point your finger, ML, and just say,
yeah.
This. Okay.
I like to do that in my basement with all the books and stuff, like that out. But yeah, so that was we both had all these ideas of poems about Detroit music, so we started there.
Okay.
And we expanded from there, and then it got totally out of control to almost 500 pages. But
well, did you guys always have the idea of poetry and lyrics together? I mean, was that just something that just came over time?
I think so. I always think of when I listen to music. I mean, I can enjoy a Beach Boys song too. There's a purpose for that. And then there's the purpose for Pet Sounds too, which is even deeper. But when I listen to the words of songs, I'm always listening for creativity and poetry in it versus just a typical rhyming song. I look for something deeper, and when I find it, it's rewarding. Like in the book, the Paul Simon piece that's in there. Well, that's an interesting little story about a homeless person in Detroit, and it's a narrative. And Papa Hobo is the name of it. So that's like, oh yeah, gotta have that. Robbie Robertson has that poem where he mentions Little Willie John, who I'm a big fan of. Listening to Little Willie John in the back seat. And Robbie Robertson writes a lot of poetry really in his lyrics and so on.
Sure.
Yeah, and even the early blues stuff like Detroit Bound is poetry. And then the Hastings Street Opera, which was done, is in the book. We transcribed it for the first time anywhere. I mean, I couldn't find it anywhere. I had to transcribe it. And that's poetry. It's like a story piece. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we I mean, obviously are from similar generations and backgrounds. So in some of the other areas, picking up on what he was talking about, we ended up doing more research because we didn't want to just represent our era,
right?
But we really wanted to bring out the range and diversity of all the voices in Detroit, which is another thing that makes Detroit really unique, I think, to really show the range, and where some of the poems and the lyrics are talking to each other in various ways, different points of view on some of the same things. Like we have Eminem in there, and then we have June Jordan's poem called Ode to Eminem, OWED. That's kind of a response to him not agreeing with the tone of some of his lyrics. And so this all these voices kind of talking to each other very passionately. I mean, I don't think we have any boring poems in there. I mean, people are really feeling it.
Yeah. Let me ask you guys, I mean, that's fascinating to me. So, did you learn something new? Did you learn something new about the voices of Detroit? I mean, you obviously have been cataloging the poetry and these lyrics over many, many years. but was there some insights into your hometown that you guys gained through this that you hadn't had previously? Was there a genre or poets or songwriters? I mean, does that make sense what I'm asking? I mean, just, you know, to me, like Detroit or any city for that matter is just a layer, you know, an onion of many layers. And I'm just wondering if you guys discovered anything new while doing this.
Well, I learned more about, I mean, I was aware that, you know, techno, for example, started in Detroit.
Right.
And, you know, like a lot of things, it's not as big in Detroit, let's say, as it is in Berlin. And, you know, because I've been fortunate, Jim, too, to teach in different parts of the world and so forth. And I did teach a Detroit music class in Germany a couple of years ago as a Fulbright specialist. And when we got to the techno part of it, those kids knew everything about Detroit techno. And it was amazing to me, the stuff they were telling me. They even credited Detroit techno for tearing down the Berlin Wall or playing a role in that. And there's documentaries out there like that, or one about that. And then there was a book I learned about from these kids that I've since gotten. I don't know if Jim knows about it, but it was written in German originally, and it's got a German name, something like Der Spiegel, Der Family, or something like that. But there is an English translation of it, which I got, and that goes into Detroit stuff in detail about the importance of Detroit techno to, you know, tearing down the wall of communism in Germany and elsewhere. So, so that's, you know, that's one of the things. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of things that we picked up on as we went through this.
Okay.
Yeah, ML and I are not exactly coming from the rave generation, so
No.
though if I was younger, I think I would have been. It's and again, that came out of to a certain extent. Some of the raves in Detroit were in abandoned auto plants,
Right.
and so again, the music and the culture and community feeding off of each other in various ways.
So the poetry itself, I mean, you guys, you know, you talk about you were picking out certain poets playing the benevolent dictator. I mean, how did you know? I mean, did you just say, you know what, I think this person will be a good poet to write about this? Or, I mean, like, how did you know? Or you know, did you know certain pieces? And, you know, not being in that process, I'm ignorant. So I'm just wondering, how did you know how to pick the people or the poems?
Well, we started with poems that we knew, you know, and that's, if we would have stayed with that, it would have been maybe 150 pages, but it just kept, you know, growing like, you know, like Detroit's scene. So, yeah, so we started like that. And then we would think about, I think, I don't know, Jim can tell me too, what his thoughts were, but, I guess benevolent dictator is not such a good word in these days, but it used to be a good word. But at any rate, we started there with what we were aware of. Jim would say, oh, you know, for example, June Jordan has a poem called Ode to Eminem. Oh, yeah, cool. And then we, you know, just kept building from that. Well, Phil Levine actually came out later in his life after his death, but in this memoir-esque book about music and Phil Levine and stuff. And I don't know if you know, but I discovered during that time period, Phil Levine actually recorded an album of him reading jazz, like later in his life, reading to jazz music, poems
for our
about
viewers. Phil Levine, we're talking about the former poet laureate. Is that correct?
Yes, and from Detroit,
yep.
and Wayne State University and all that. So we, you know, like I knew Phil had these poems and had connections to him and Ed Hirsch, who kind of runs the estate. And so that's like, got to have that, you know, got to get that stuff in there.
Okay.
You know, so I mean, that was sort of how we started with it. And then there were certain folks we asked, you know, to do different kinds of writing. Lolita Hernandez, she's, you know, I know she's into music and stuff like that. she started as a poet, but turned into a sort of a fiction writer. But she did a nice prose poem that incorporated Motown, and Desiree Cooper did too. So we kind of converted some fiction writers into poets for the project, which is not something that's new to me. I've made many. Jim knows, he's been on it a couple of times with this annual labor reading. I've made a lot of people labor poets and musicians who, when I mention their names to others, I go, what? Like Alicia Ostriker, working class poet, what? So, yeah, Jorma Kaukonen, working class songwriter, which I've read his book. It's not so much true, but you know what I mean? But for the sake of that, I converted him, so.
Sure. How about you, Jim?
Yeah, there were certain, like I wanted us to include Nikki Giovanni's poem for Aretha, which is a long sort of famous poem that Nikki actually did a recording to, with kind of a choir behind her. And I felt like that really captured a lot of, when I thought of poetry about Detroit music, I thought of, that poem came to mind right away. One of the challenges and adventures, if you ever do an anthology, is getting permissions, and the permissions for some of the more famous poets and musicians were a challenge in terms of, because we didn't have a budget for that stuff. So
a lot of groveling.
Yeah. But so we didn't get everything we wanted, but we were surprised at the generosity, and thank all the people who could have demanded a lot more of a fee, who saw that we were working with the university press, and we were doing it out of love for the material, not out of any delusions of making money off the thing.
So I got to ask, guys, you guys got up to 400 pages, 400 and some pages. How much was left out? I mean, you guys were looking at 150 pages, you got up to 450 pages. I mean, and I'm not asking you to specify what was left out, but I mean, in the editing process, in your selection process, and all those voluminous emails, I mean, I'm guessing there were things left out, maybe because of copyright implications, or maybe because of permissions, but I mean, is there another book? And I'm going to ask you to each maybe think about reading a piece, but I'm just wondering, in all this, in this work of love, was there something or things that were left out or had to be left out?
Well, the only thing that comes, the main thing that comes to my mind that's being left out, I don't think we really cut anything. There were a couple of poems that we wanted, and we just couldn't find the poet. Like we had read it somewhere in a magazine or review, and then went looking for the poet. One was a poet in Chicago who turned up, she had been murdered, I mean, a couple of years before. And we were looking, and I thought, I'm going to find this person. Well, I found her all right in the obituaries, but she disappeared. That was it, from a library. And so there were a few things, and there was that other guy in the Philippines that we wanted, but his name was, I don't know, what was his name, like Sharky or something. And it's like, well, where do you start in a phone? Man Ray or something like that. Where do you start in a phone book with Sharky? And but finally, I kept digging, and I found leads and leads, and he was honored to be a part of it. The only one that comes to my mind when this question comes up is I really wanted Smokey Robinson in it, and the reason why is Smokey actually is a poet, and he published a chapbook of all things, and he did it himself. I don't know what he was thinking, but he just had it printed himself.
Can I ask when? I mean, was that before?
Yeah, it's probably 10 years ago. 10 years ago.
Oh, really? So much more recent.
Yeah, and you can buy it on his website, which I did. You know, you can buy it signed for an extra $5 or something. And so I got a signed one from him, but he also read some of them on, remember Def Poetry Jam on HBO? He came on and read a couple of them, and they were real poems. They weren't song lyrics, and they were good. They were political, they were biting. And I really tried super hard to get through to him, because I knew if I could get through to him, he'd really want to be a part of it. He wouldn't, I don't think he would have given us any copyright trouble or anything like that.
Right.
Because, you know, when people, that's an appeal that I've made often over the years with musicians, is they don't see themselves as poets when many of them are. And even Dylan, that's true of Dylan with this other book that I did. You know, Dylan will give you any lyric that you want for a poetry anthology, basically, or at least he did me. And why? Because Dylan sees himself as a poet, you know, and he's honored when someone recognizes that he's a poet. And I think the Nobel Prize, you know, showed that. It just blew him out of the water. He didn't even know what to say about it for a while. So I don't know, does that make, what I'm saying makes sense, but yeah, that, so Smokey was the missing link. And then, of course, as things go, I'm working with a guy in Los Angeles right now on a book about Black Bottom. And it turns out he knows Smokey. Well, I wish I'd met him, you know, 5 years ago. He could have gotten us through to Smokey, but otherwise, but that's water under the bridge. But that's the one example I can think of. Otherwise, I don't know. Jim, what do you think? I mean,
well, it was interesting to see what musicians inspired poets the most. And I know that we had a lot of work about the MC5, and including work by the MC5,
Right.
3 of the MC5.
3 of them.
Yeah. And so, you know, it's hard to remember in the process, but we were trying to balance it out across the genres. And so I think we tried to be inclusive as we could, and
Sure.
not just put together a specific vision. And that's one of the reasons how we ended up so long. But of course, yeah, inevitably you find poems or writers later that say, oh, we should have had this. But we really did spend a lot of time and get suggestions from other writers. And sometimes we were just fortunate in a way in terms of timing, like Peter Balakian had just won the Pulitzer Prize and in poetry. And I happened to see him read and was able to talk to him about the book, because he has this poem, Joe Lewis's Fist, that really has a lot of Detroit music stuff in it. And so, one of the things we're talking about while we're waiting to get started here was to doing another book, maybe of prose. And, and so we're still thinking about it, because we're out there listening and hearing things, and just the impact. And ML did a previous anthology that he could talk about.
Well, yeah, that, I mean, the poetry, when I did Heaven Was Detroit, which, Tim, you're familiar with, originally I wanted that to be sort of a literary reader. It would have a poetry section of poems about Detroit music. It would have stories, and it would have creative nonfiction essays in it. And so when Wayne State agreed to do it, they asked if I wouldn't consider it being, you know, more of an essay historical thing as it became. But I still had that idea in the back of my head. And I thought, you know, that idea is worth fleshing out and working with. And Jim thought so too. And he actually had promoted that idea to a couple of places where there were some nibbles on it. And then I thought, well, you know, let's see if Michigan State will do it, because Jim publishes his fiction through them, and then we merged our talents, and they loved the idea, and then we were kind of off and running. So that's how the genesis of the book, and obviously now with a fiction or prose approach to it, that comes out of respect, out of that book with the poem. So
Okay.
one thing leads to another, which I think is an old Fix song, but that's another issue.
I think you're right. So let me ask you guys, is there a piece that you would like to read today, just to share? I mean, is there something that you, would like to just share with our audience today?
Yeah, do you want, I'm just looking in my tablet here.
Here's a short poem that I think kind of crystallizes the connection between emotion and music. And one of the things people say, music is the universal language, right? In terms of how it translates across cultures. But if you hear part of a song, it can take you to an emotional place, and that's one of the sort of magical things about music. I got a poem in my, so I continue to listen to music and write about it ourselves. So I have a poem in my new book where we went to this concert by the new Pornographers as a group, and we were it was in an old church, so we were all standing up, and I was one of the oldest people in the crowd, and I bent down to tie my shoe at one point, and some young people next to us thought I was like passing out or something. and so I wrote a poem about
Ain't that a damn shame, Tim?
But I was there. It was a good concert. But my wife had to reassure them that I was okay.
You're all right. You're right. You're not falling over. Nice.
No. But this is by a poet that ML and I kind of knew when he was growing up, Chaim Charara. And it's called Bob Seger's Night Moves on the Radio in Winter.
Nice.
And just thinking about that title already takes you somewhere. But the key, I think, is that the title sets it up, but the poem doesn't deal specifically with the music, but you kind of hear it because the subtitle is Leaving Henry Ford Hospital, Detroit. The nurse did what she could to ease her into her death. The dying was effortless, but not watching it happen. When it happened, I remembered her 20 years before, walking through snow at night to buy milk. So the poignancy of that loss and the poignancy of that song, I think, really combine in a very short poem that brings it all together.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just looking at one that I really like, and the sound of it too, the music and the poetry is, and Jim had a chance to meet Billy Bragg during a working class conference in England, and he just happened to have a what do you call it, a galley of the book, I believe, and he was very easy to have in it as well. Just asking, and he loves Motown. And maybe you got more insight. I met him before at the Ruther House in Detroit. They had brought him in to play some shows. It could have been for the striking newspaper people. I can't remember. But I wanted his poem, Levi Stubbs' Tears, in the book. And I don't know if you know that, Tim. You're a youngster. You probably know you got his whole catalog in your head. But Levi Stubbs' Tears, that always, I used to show movies, or still do, in my labor classes with Billy Bragg on tour in Russia and everywhere. And he'd always do this song, and it stuck in my head. And so I'll try this as just a poem type of thing. With the money from her accident, she brought herself a mobile home, so at least she could get some enjoyment out of being alone. No one could say that she was left up on the shelf. If you and me, it's you and me against the world, kid, she mumbled to herself. When the world falls apart, some things stay in place. Levi Stubbs' tears run down his face. She ran away from her home in her mother's best coat. She was married before she even was entitled to vote, and her husband was one of those blokes, the sort that only laughs at his own jokes. That's the sort a war takes away, and when there wasn't a war, he left anyway. Norman Whitfield, Barrett Strong are here to make everything right that's wrong. Holland and Lamont Dozier too, and here to make it all okay with you. One dark night he came home from the sea and put a hole in her body where no hole should be. It hurt her more to see him walking out the door, and though they stitched her back together, they left her heart in pieces on the floor. When the world falls apart, some things stay in place. She takes off the Four Tops tape, puts it back in its case, and the world falls apart. Some things stay in place. Levi Stubbs' tears run down her face. So
Fantastic.
Now, if that isn't a poem, I don't know what it is.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's fantastic. Thank
It's
you.
beautiful.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So, in conclusion, what I ask everybody all the time is, what's the significance for you for being chosen as a Michigan Notable Book author?
Well, for me, it's a really high honor because I'm from the working class. You know, we don't win awards. In fact, when you called, I guess, or emailed, I was like kind of stunned and appreciative. I mean, it's huge. To me, it's the National Book Award. You know, it's a major thing. So, and it always has been.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and Jim's won a few times too. So,
Well, one of the things that's great about the Michigan Notable Books Award program is people who are not readers or not regular readers as much find out about the books. And, you know, before COVID, with the library tours, you know, my parents came to one of my notable book readings at a library in the Detroit area, and just the idea of having my name in the newspaper for people I grew up with. I still have most of my family and friends are still in Michigan. That sense of recognition in the larger world outside of the literary world, I think is really important for all books and for all readers. And that's one of the great things the Notable Books program does. And so it's a bigger thrill than winning some literary prize that only other writers are going to know about.
Okay, well, thank you guys, and thank you for your wonderful contribution. I'm wondering, is there anything else you guys would like to add at the conclusion of today?
well, I've actually been doing a couple of libraries. I'm doing Wayne County Community College, I did put together pre-COVID well, we did actually do a few, and Jim was at some of them.
Mm-hmm.
We did, and I put together kind of another music show to go with it, with one of my bands, and we did do a few of them. I think the last one we did was February 2020. At the 29th, it was the last odd day of the month, and then this stuff happened. Actually, the last reading that we did too was March 2nd in Ann Arbor from the book. So we did get a few in, and I did have and do have a poetry presentation with music. But we did a library in White Lake last week. We did the Heaven Was Detroit show. That's what they wanted. So we did that. I had a show with that too. And then we're going to do Wayne County Community College. And before that, we did the Beatle thing at Saline Library. So that stuff started, and I'm doing some live stuff. I did my Lit Walk live this year, which was just June 26th in St. Clair Shores. And we're going to do a live poets. So things are like slowly coming back.
You
And
know,
that's
now
the
I'll extend this invitation to you, ML. You know, our courtyard, once we get that opened up again, we are still it's slowly opening up, and not to put in a bunch of logistical stuff here, but I think I will invite you to help us open up the Library of Michigan again.
Oh, great,
I think-
great.
I
Oh,
think we
yeah.
wanna
Okay,
extend
you're
that
not
to-
open. Yeah.
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 No, that'd be great. And, you know, most of the musicians in my group live closer to Lansing than they do St. Clair Shores. That I know from experience.
Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah, we did our big launch for the book at ML, where ML's background is, Third Man Records. Here we are. And that was just incredible. I mean,
That was.
because we had, I don't know how many contributors there. We had, you know, a band, ML's band, and a lot of the writers who read with musical accompaniment, and it was just a real. You know, I was hoping we could do more of them, but we were able to do the big launch in Detroit, and that was a real highlight in terms of reaching an audience with this book. So we're hoping that this recognition, you know, helps continue the life of the book, because the pandemic, like a lot of the books, kind of slowed down our momentum right when we were sort of gearing up. Because it's a great book to put on your shelves. And we do have, I should mention before we leave, a playlist for the book.
Oh, yeah, right.
Okay.
That, where
It's
is
on
that at?
Spotify.
Spotify, yeah.
Really?
So, yeah.
Yeah, look up Respect, the what is it, poetry anthology playlist or something like that. There's a Heaven Was Detroit list too out there.
Okay. All right. I definitely look for it. I have a long.
Yeah, on Spotify.
That's all right. That's all right.
Okay.
Well, guys, thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being interviewed. And thanks to all our viewers. Again, this is Respect, the Poetry of Detroit Music with Jim Daniels and ML Liebler. Gentlemen, thank you so much for today, and have a great day, and look forward to more works coming from both of you.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.